Good evening. I'm Stesha Brandon, the Literature and Humanities Program Manager at the Seattle Public Library. And as we begin tonight, I would like to acknowledge that here in Seattle, we are on Indigenous land. In Seattle, these are the traditional unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Duwamish people. We honor their elders past and present and thank them for the stewardship of this land. Welcome to tonight's program, which is presented in partnership with Elliott Bay Book Company. We're grateful to our author series sponsor, the Gary and Connie Kunis Foundation, and the Seattle Times for generous support of library programs. Thank you as well to the Seattle Public Library Foundation. Private gifts to the foundation from thousands of donors help the library provide free programs and services that touch the lives of everyone in our community. I have just a couple quick announcements before we get started. Our friends over at Elliott Bay have copies of Clyde's books. You can find his books on their website, elliottbaybook.com, and I'm going to drop links to the direct links to that specific book, the new book of Blood and Sweat, in the chat, and I'll also put some links to other books by Clyde in the chat as well. And then after tonight's conversation or event, after Clyde tells us about his book, we'll have time for questions from you. You can ask your question at any time by writing it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And finally, at the end of the event, I'll post a link to a survey so you can tell us what you think. We'd appreciate it if you took a minute after the event to fill it out. Now, I am delighted to welcome Karen Maeda-Allman from Elliott Bay Book Company, who's going to introduce tonight's speaker. Hi, Karen.
Hi, thank you so much, Stesha. And it is my pleasure and honor to introduce Bellingham writer Clyde W. Ford. He's the director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Library Publishing Project at HarperCollins Publishers. And he is also the renowned author of 13 books, both fiction and nonfiction. He's received so many accolades, including a 2006 Zora Neale Hurston Richard Wright Foundation Award for Fiction, and was in 2019 a finalist for the Foundation's Nonfiction Award. He's also received many, many accolades locally, including being named a literary lion multiple times by the King County Library System, and most recently, his book, Think Black, based on his father's experiences as the first Black software engineer, as well as other research. This book was awarded the 2021 Washington State Book Award for Creative Nonfiction. His books have included some well-received mystery novels, books about healing, and also a book about steps we can take to end racism. We've had a long and warm relationship with Clyde Ford over so many years and so many books at Elliott Bay. And now, tonight, he's going to be here to speak about his most recently published book, Blood and Sweat, Black Lives in the Making of White Power and Wealth. It's a remarkable book, rich with details about the contributions of Black labor in creating and maintaining wealth and power in our country. And this labor most often did not benefit or bring about full participation of Black people. The enslavement of Black people is part of, but certainly not all of this story. Today, the Seattle Times posted his op-ed, Reparations for Slavery, a Roadmap. And we're going to link to this in the chat. In this op-ed, he makes the case for reparations for Black Americans, and he makes the case for following California's lead in creating a Washington State Commission to study the case for reparations. His book, Black of Blood and Sweat, can be read in part as an argument for these reparations. It's also a book that brings seemingly disparate histories together to tell a story about the interconnections of real people, not abstractions. This is our history, fascinating, troubling, and often enraging, I have to say. It's a wonderful book, and I'm so glad to be able to hear you speak about it tonight. So, Clyde W. Ford, please take the stage, I guess.
Thank you so much, Karen. What a beautiful introduction. And I was thinking as you were saying that, wow, I wonder who they're talking about. That's really interesting. Maybe I should read some of his books. And Stesha, I also want to reach out to the Seattle Public Library through you and say thank you so much. Both of your institutions have really been supportive, so supportive over the years of my career. Karen, as you mentioned, without going into detail, my history with Elliott Bay Books goes back almost 30 years. And I've had the opportunity to speak about almost every one of the books I've written, fiction and nonfiction, at Elliott Bay Bookstore. And we were just saying before this program in the Ready Room how much I loved the old Pioneer Square location and appreciated how there was really an attempt to recreate that venue downstairs in the new location. And Stasha, you know, I can't say enough about the Seattle Public Library. Not only is it a place where I did research for the book, which was awarded the Washington State Book Award, but it was Seattle Public Library librarians who encouraged me to make sure I applied for that award, and were also really important in facilitating the fact that I did and was able to win that Washington State Book Award in creative nonfiction. So I love libraries in general. I love the Seattle Public Library in specific. And I just love that we have such a vibrant community here in Seattle and the Puget Sound area that are a community of readers and thinkers in the way that we are. What I wanted to do was to start by reading a selection from the book, really chapter 1, not the whole chapter, but the beginning of chapter 1, that in some ways I think captures the essence of what I wanted to do with this book, what I tried to do in writing this book, and how I went about writing this book. So again, this is directly from chapter 1, from the opening to chapter 1. Antony Negro and Isabel Negro is how they were known in the 1625 ledger of Captain William Tucker of Elizabeth City, Virginia. In all likelihood, they also had African names that only the ages now know. They may have been baptized shortly after birth, and their anglicized names conferred to them by Portuguese priests who'd ventured deep into the interior of Angola, where Catholicism was well established by the 16th century. Or Portuguese priests may have performed obligatory baptisms and christenings of these two young people as they were herded into the hold of the San Juan the Baptist, a Portuguese slave ship at anchor in Luanda Bay off the coast of Angola in the late Central African rainy season of 1619. Let's call them Anthony and Isabella, for the sake of our narrative. Two among the 20 and odd Negroes Sir John Rolfe recorded aboard the Dutch man of war, the White Lion, lying at anchor on August 20th, 1619, at the mouth of the James River off Point Comfort, Virginia. Anthony and Isabella carried within them the germinal cells of the first Black child born in America, though on that fateful day in August 1619, they probably did not know that. Nor did they know his name. Nor could they have known that symbolically they also carried within them the germinal cells of Scipio and Crispus and Nat and Sojourner and Maggie and Frederick and Booker T and W.E.B. and Marcus and Langston and Duke and Yardbird and Train and Malcolm and Martin and Rosa and Barack and Trayvon and Eric and Breonna and George and me. And countless millions who in some measure or part were torn like them from Africa's soil. Anthony and Isabella stepped from the decks of the White Lion into a pinnace, bobbing in the surf off Point Comfort, a small boat that would carry them to the white planters and merchants and colonists waiting ashore, men who had just determined their worth in terms of salted meat and vegetables and grain and the other provisions needed by the captain of the White Lion. What they did not know then, could not know then, is that in being handed over to these men, they were about to embark on a journey of unimaginably epic proportions. A heroic journey in which during their lives, they would endure great hardships and privations. A symbolic journey that would see their work lay the foundation of the economics, politics, religion, medicine, education, industry, law enforcement, and technology of a new nation. And a hard-earned journey that would generate great power and wealth for some, that sadly Anthony and Isabella and those like them, for the most part, would never share. In their interactions with those white men ashore lay the embryonic maps of many roads, some surveyed and taken, others surveyed and deemed unworthy. American slavery, American freedom, Bacon's Rebellion, the Revolutionary War, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, Nat Turner's Rebellion, the Cotton Gin, the Age of Sail, the Civil War, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the Great Migration, railroads, mines, oil drilling, racism, lynching, Red Summer, 2 world wars, 2 marches on Washington, the murders of Malcolm and Martin, the gunning down of Trayvon and Ahmed, the killing of George Floyd, and the many other events shaped by the interaction of Black folks and white folks here in America. Anthony and Isabella did not know this then, and neither did the men ashore, like Captain William Tucker, who would acquire and settle the couple to work on his plan present-day Hampton, Virginia. But today, we can know what became of those seeds, real and symbolic, which Anthony and Isabella carried within them. We can know of the roads taken and those that were not. And where they could not know, we must not forget. Thank you. You know, one of the first questions that I get in terms of this book is this book a book about critical race theory? And I really, in some respects, find that question interesting. And I get it from both sides, those who feel they're in support of critical race theory and those who don't. And I find it interesting because on both sides of this issue, my sense is that very few people understand what they're talking about when they talk about critical race theory. Now, the historical truth is that critical race theory is a theory that came out of the legal field, and in particular, some legal scholars like Derek Bell at Harvard University back in the late 1970s and 80s. But more importantly than that, what I find lacking in the discourse around critical race theory in this country is a basic understanding of what a theory is as opposed to what facts and historical truths are. So in the discourse on critical race theory, where you get people saying, well, I don't want my kids to learn about critical race theory in school. Look, a theory is a way that you attempt to understand an assemblage, in this case, of historical truths or facts. The problem we have today is that most people, from Trump right on down, don't understand what a theory is, probably because they didn't do too well in 10th grade geometry, which was really when we were supposed to learn about the difference between theorems and propositions and truths. And in fact, a theory is not a historical truth. I'll just give you a simple example, which we'll probably come back to as I talk a little bit more about all the things that those opposed to critical race theory don't want you to know. That would be this. In the book, I talk about Jefferson, not just as a slaveholder, that's bad enough, but I think what's even worse is that he was a debtor to the tune of millions of dollars in today's valuation, who used the enslavement in women that he had as collateral for his debt. Now that's a fact, that's a historical truth. It's not a theory And saying that doesn't mean that I am presenting a theory, because you can go to my website of bloodandsweat.com and find in Thomas Jefferson's handwriting a copy of the deed he writes to his creditors in Europe saying, look, I know I owe you lots of money and I'm going to pay back that money. And if I don't pay it back, I'm pledging the enslaved men and women that I own as collateral for that debt. That's a historical fact. That's a historical truth. And critical race theory would simply try to fit that historical truth into a larger narrative to try to make sense of why did he do that? And what did that have to do with how banking eventually was built on this idea of enslaved people being acceptable collateral for debt and mortgages? So I just want to say, as we start this discussion, as you listen to me, please understand, and as you listen and perhaps participate in this public discourse on critical race theory, understand the difference between a theory and a set of historical facts and truths. And I think it's fine to have a vigorous, although I hope respectable, debate about theory, but I am not here to debate about historical truth that we can prove based on evidence that is of a given standard. My book is not as much about critical race theory as it is about presenting historical truths and perhaps questioning them in a way that might allow you, the reader, to come to some determinations of your own. Now, it just so happens that in presenting those historical truths, it's very supportive of many of the precepts of critical race theory. But the book itself, and I think the important aspect of what we need to understand, is about the historical truths which really contribute to the creation of the country that we live in. So having said that, I want to talk then about some of the historical truths that those who are so dead set against critical race theory don't want you to know. And in talking about these historical truths that those against critical race theory don't want you to know, in a sense, it steps through the various chapters that I write about in the book. And I think I would start by saying one of the truths that people who are dead set against critical race theory don't want you to know, a really fundamental, inconvenient truth, is that the men who left Europe in those pretty small boats, they were 30, 32, maybe 34 feet at most, like Columbus, like Magellan, like da Gama, and all of the explorers we learned about in school. What those opposed to critical race theory don't want you to know is that those men did not leave on some beneficent voyage, altruistic voyage of self-discovery under a prime directive like you've seen in Star Trek, where we're going to explore worlds beyond Europe. And when we get there, we want to interact with those cultures in this really wonderful way that preserves them while they understand us. That is not the way that those European explorers left Europe for other parts of the world. They left under the most harsh and brutal directives that you can imagine. In fact, it was Pope Nicholas V who in 1415 issued what's called a Papal Bull, and a bull, that's not one of those animals with horns. It's a directive from Rome that basically says you are blessed by Christianity and the Christian God to go and do this, and the this that they were blessed to go and do, and these are the actual words, was to kill, rape, subjugate, and enslave whatever cultures they came in contact with. And again, the bull that was entitled Dum Diversas, which in Latin basically means until I tell you to do something different. I have a copy of that on the website for people to read so that they don't think I just made that up. Now, why why would I even start a book about Black lives in America with that prime directive in the 1400s, 1452, from the Catholic Church? And I would start it there for this reason, and I think it's a truth that most people don't know, and a lot of people don't want you to know. When Columbus, for example, arrived in present-day Hispaniola, that's the island that encompasses both the Dominican Republic and Haiti, he was there not, again, as an ambassador of goodwill. He was there for one purpose, or two purposes, really, for power and wealth. And the wealth was really the thought that in this area they were going to find mines, and they were going to find gold mines and silver mines, and they were going to mine those mines. And I can tell you, it wasn't the Europeans thinking that they were going to mine those mines. They were thinking with this Papal Bull in hand that they were going to enslave the native inhabitants of those islands to mine the mines so they could accumulate the wealth, which would then give them the power to essentially rule the seas. Now, it's called the Columbian Exchange after Columbus. And that is the reporting of what actually happened. Certainly, Columbus was able to find in this continent, in this part of the world, lots of things that he then took back to Europe, like various plants, various herbs, tobacco, different spices. But he also, and his men, left something in the Western Hemisphere. It's called the Columbian Exchange for a reason. Yes, goods and produce and ideas and other ways of agriculture went from west to east, but from east to west came disease. Some 27 diseases by one of the accounts that I read, smallpox being one of the major ones. When Columbus arrived in 1492 in Hispaniola, and in that region, there were several million, 1 million Taino natives. Within 10 years, that population had dwindled down on Puerto Rico to 15,000. Again, not my reporting. This is some scholars from Yale who report on this. So now you've got this government, or in this case, Spain and Portugal, who have an established presence here in the New World, but nobody to work the mines that would produce the riches for them. And so they start to scratch their head and think, oh my God, we got to get people to work for us to generate the power and wealth that we're supposed to find here. And that is when they turned to Africa as the place of the human resources that would generate the power and wealth that they felt they could extract from the Western Hemisphere. So throughout Central America and South America, Spain and Portugal, and later on other countries like France and the Netherlands and England established colonies that were then populated by Africans essentially ripped from the continent of Africa in order to work for the wealth and power of those European nations. That's one of the truths that those against critical race theory don't want you to know. That's why I started the book in pre-colonial times, because what goes on in the late 1400s and the early 1500s is a blueprint for what later happens in the United States. And so another truth that I think those opposed to critical race theory don't want you to know would be that the date 1619 is not the date when slavery started in the United States. Look, Anthony and Isabella, who I read about in that excerpt from my book, yes, they were among the first 20, 22, the number actually varies, of Africans who stepped off the boat into colonial Virginia in exchange for the goods and services that ship captain Colin Jope needed. But they did not step into a system of chattel slavery. That is a really important fact that I think escapes most people. In some instances, escapes people regardless of their skin color. I hear a lot of African Americans who say to me, slavery started in 1619. It did not. There was no system. No one had a system laid out in their mind saying, we're just waiting for some folks from Africa to get here so we can lay this on them. The reason that's important critically important is that the system of slavery was a choice made by colonial American planters and merchants and the wealthy 1% in order to support the wealth and power that they began to accumulate. It was a choice. It was not an inevitability. There were other options open to colonial Virginia society. That's the truth that those against critical race theory don't want you, I think, to really understand, because a nation is built on making choices. And one of the things I try to show in this book is that at every turn where the country came to a point of wanting or needing to make a choice, that choice was made in a way that we now live today, with divisiveness racially, with divisiveness in terms of wealth, and it didn't have to be that way. And that, for me, is, I think, more revealing and, yes, more damning about the choices that were made. You know, another truth that I think a lot of folks who are against the ideas of critical race theory don't want you to know is that the founding fathers, mostly, the founders, were great debtors. Now, I mentioned that earlier with Jefferson, but it's not just Jefferson. It's Jefferson, Washington, Madison. You name the founders, and they were in hock up to their, well, you name the body part. That's what they were in hock to. Who were they in hock to? They were in hock to European creditors. Why? Because they recreated in the United States a lifestyle which was so lavish and so really unsustainable and unsupportable that European creditors just said, well, we just keep giving these guys money and more money and more money. And eventually, not long before the American Revolutionary War, the European credit market tightened, and those creditors then turned to Washington and Jefferson and Madison and others and said, you know what? We want our money now. And I am not saying that the American Revolutionary War was because these founders wanted to get out from under the debt that they owed. But what I found so cynical in writing these chapters of the book was that these men actually used the word that they felt enslaved to their creditors at the very point in time that they held sometimes thousands of men and women enslavement. So I think that's a point that I was surprised about. I never learned in school. I never learned that Washington and Jefferson and Madison were great debtors. And I never learned that some of the elements of the Declaration of Independence were specifically because of what the British did regarding slavery. Almost as though there's two American revolutions, the one we learn about in school and then the one that happened for African Americans living in the country at this time. Again, I'd love to say more about this, but I'll just say this. 1775, the then governor of Virginia issues a proclamation, and that proclamation says, look, if you're African descent and you're enslaved and you can escape and get to the British lines, King George has declared that you will be free. Some 10,000 or more, I think it was even more than 10,000 Africans took them up on this. And that is a part of American history that I think I never learned about, and I doubt many people know about, but it is incredibly important in terms of better understanding, certainly the history of African Americans in this country. So another fact that I think people who are against or opposed to critical race theory don't want you to know. Those opposed to critical race theory also don't want you to know that the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, any of the amendments Certainly the early Constitution, the first version of the Constitution, never even mentions the word slave or slavery in it. And yet 25% of the clauses in that Constitution were the North appeasing the South over one issue and one issue only, and that was slavery. And we still live with the consequences of that appeasement to this very day. Every time I hear about a mass shooting and about somebody popping up and saying that owning guns is a right enshrined in the Constitution, I think that it's just a farce. That is not why and how the Second Amendment came into being. And one only needs to read the actual discussion and debate that took place between Northern delegates and Southern delegates in 1787 in Philadelphia at the Second Constitutional Convention. And by the way, one of the things that those gentlemen were smart enough to do was to record the debates that took place so you can read them and make up your own mind about what they're saying. What you hear time and again is the word militia used as Southern code, as a dog whistle for slave patrols. So when I think of this idea that we have somehow enshrined into the Constitution a right to bear arms, and I have to say, even as I listened with a great deal of pride to the nomination or the hearings for Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, I am not a believer that that right to bear arms has anything to do with militias, because back in 1787, everybody understood militia was a code word for slave patrols. And just as another example, the 3/5 clause, which many people know has been repealed, that it was the idea that the North did not want the South its whites and enslaved blacks for the purposes of representation. And so they came up with a compromise, 3/5 compromise, which counted African Americans as 3/5 in order to somehow equalize the power of the South and the power of the North. Of course, it's just on its face cynical, because you count people who don't have representation, which was the whole basis for having a Revolutionary War, taxation or counting without representation. But let's not go there. Let's just talk about how we're still living with the 3/5 compromise, because the 3/5 compromise not only determined the makeup of the United States Congress, it was the way that we elected and still elect a president. So the idea that the United States is a popular democracy is just, it's false. It has nothing to do with reality. The United States is not a popular democracy, never has been. The United States is a democracy based on the will, not of the people, but the will of the Electoral College, and that is based on a 3/5 compromise, which comes right from the North appeasing the South in terms of slavery. So again, another truth that those opposed to critical race theory do not want you to know. I just published an op-ed today. Seattle Times is so kind to allow me to do that. Mark Higgins at the op-ed desk at the Seattle Times over the years has become, I would even say, a friend, in that we've had the opportunity to work together on a number of issues. And I think another issue, an inconvenient truth that many people don't want you to know, is that the United States has actually gone down the road of reparations before. And I talk about this in the book. It was shortly after the end of the Civil War. And what I found so interesting about this period was a number of things. First, a lot of people are told in school that Lincoln freed slaves. Oh boy, I'm sorry, that is just not true. Read the Emancipation Proclamation, as I finally did word for word. And you will see in that document that Lincoln did not free a single slave under his control. Lincoln, in the Emancipation Proclamation, freed slaves in Mississippi, but allowed and didn't do anything about slaves in Massachusetts. And so slavery in Delaware, for example, was on the books until the 1900s because of that. It's a farce. Now, a lot of there were places around the world, particularly England, it was interestingly enough, that some of the English papers picked up on this and said, look, the Emancipation is kind of a joke, because what Lincoln is really saying is the only way you can enslave other people is that if you're loyal to the northern forces of the Union, which I found very interesting. So first thing, again, the truth that folks don't want you to know is that the Emancipation Proclamation did not free a single slave under Lincoln's control, because the South never recognized Lincoln's control anyway. It was more of a military ploy or a military move than it was some altruistic sense that Lincoln had that he was going to, in some way, reach out to those who were enslaved. So that's one kind of inconvenient truth. I think another inconvenient truth that a lot of people don't know, and a lot of other folks don't want you to know, is that Lincoln had no plan for what he and the nation should do with those freed, formerly enslaved people. The South, interestingly enough, did have a plan. The South's plan said, look, if we win the war, we probably can't keep those African descendants in the same condition that they were before. So we'll kind of make this halfway state where they're not really full citizens, but they're certainly, they're not really enslaved. And they actually used the term in this, we'll keep them in perpetual serfdom. This is Judah Benjamin, who was the Secretary of State for the Confederacy. And one of the things I like to say, I think I may have even said it in the book, is the North may have won the war, but the South seems like they actually got what they wanted in terms of the status of African Americans. So right after the Civil War, Union General William Sherman actually comes up with a plan for reparations, which Lincoln approves. And the plan is this: we're going to take away, because we won the war, meaning the North, we're going to take away 400,000 acres of coastal land from slaveholders. And as reparations, this was the term used, we're going to give that land to the formerly enslaved. That acreage went up from 400,000, another 500,000, to a total of almost 1 million acres, 900,000 acres. The map of that is well known. I actually give it again on my website, where I tried to provide some supplements for the book of bloodandsweat.com. So I give a map of that acreage. That was the acreage that was to be distributed. A bureau was set up to do that distribution. That bureau was headed by General Otis Oliver Howard, whom Howard University is actually named for 40,000 people. Formerly enslaved people were actually given title to land. A lot of people know this as 40 acres and a mule. That's where it comes from. It was General Sherman's plan, called Special Field Orders 15 for military, which distributed this land to African Americans and was in the process of doing it to a lot more than 40,000 people when Lincoln was assassinated. And the first thing that Andrew Johnson did was to rescind Special Orders 15, or to rescind 40 acres and a mule, to take back all the land that had been distributed to those 40,000 African American families, and to return all of the 900,000 acres to former slaveholders. So again, for me, it is an example of when this country went down a road that might have led to healing and reconciliation, and then did a very sharp about face and came back. And one of the things I say in the Seattle Times article that I really believe is, when people ask, well, where do we, even if we're for reparations, how the heck do we start? How do we figure out a dollar amount? How do we even talk about the finances of this? I've got a really simple answer. It's almost like common sense. Look, there's a map of those 900,000 acres that's well known. As I said, I reproduce it on my website. The value in today's dollar terms can easily be computed. Some of the best land right now in terms of all, Hilton Head and all the development that's taken place. And again, it was fine prime land and it's appreciated tremendously. Whatever the value of that 900 acres of land is in today's dollar amount, that's where to start. in terms of talking about reparations. Now, how that land is, how the reparations are actually distributed, as I say in the Seattle Times, there's lots of ways to consider that. I don't think land redistribution is the way to do it today, but it can be there's lots of possibilities. College tuition credits, tax breaks, outright payments, you name it. Lots of ways to do that. I mentioned a little bit more about Washington State's experience actually with reparations to the Japanese who were interned during World War II in the op-ed today in the Seattle Times. But that's another thing that I think a lot of people don't want you to know and to contemplate is the history of issues like reparations. So when we have these discussions today, we're not just doing them out of the clear blue, but we've got some understanding of what the history is, where these ideas come from, what has been tried in the past, and we've got a basis for moving forward. Look, I'll conclude by saying this. I am a really big believer in truth and reconciliation. South Africa is not perfect, but Desmond Tutu, when he was alive, headed the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which tried to bring together those who had actually enacted some of the most brutal measures during apartheid, along with their victims, to engage in a process that would result in healing. Our neighbors to the north, Canada, have also attempted to enter a truth and reconciliation process with the First Nations people who were so brutalized by many Canadian policies throughout the years. I've often thought that a truth and reconciliation process is what we need in this country as well, too, particularly in respect to the period of enslavement, the long period. But the one thing that's important about truth and reconciliation, which I think those opposed to critical race theory don't want you to know or come to an understanding of, is you don't get to the reconciliation until you get to the truth. And that's really what I wanted to do in this book, is to get to the truths that might be the basis for us getting to the reconciliation. So having said those few words about something of what the book encompasses, I think it's probably time to turn to some questions. And I think it was Stasha who said she was going to come back and maybe see if there were questions that I could try to answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Clyde. That was such an amazing, quick tour through the book, and people will definitely need to read it to get the full depth and nuance of everything that you've given us a taste for tonight. So thank you so much for that. So I have a question here that I'm going to read in just one second, but I also want to remind folks that you can ask your question by typing it in the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your screen. You can do that at any time, so go ahead and do that. But Clyde, we'll start with this one. So Karen and I were chatting actually before you joined us backstage, and she mentioned that you had been chatting with her about a group of 600 enslaved people who traveled to Washington Territory and then escaped to freedom in Victoria. And so we're wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that history, and then, talk a little bit more about perhaps, why they couldn't stay here in Washington Territory at that time.
Yeah, so this story is really quite a wonderful one, and it's very personal for me. I'm a boater. I've cruised the Inside Passage for a number of years between Seattle and Alaska. When I first started boating, actually, it even is before that. It's like the first time I ever came out here. I was on Salt Spring Island because I had a friend who lived on Salt Spring Island. And I walked into City Hall, and there's a picture of a Black woman. And I said to myself, who is that? And my friend kind of knew, people knew her name was Sylvia Stark, but there was not much more than that. So years later, after I moved out here, I was riding in a bus. I had been in Canada. I don't know, I think I flew out of Vancouver. I'm riding a bus back to the United States. I'm sitting next to this woman from Los Angeles, and she says, well, my name is, I don't remember her first name, but her last name was Stark. And I said, are you related to? She says, yeah, that's my great-great-grandmother. And she told me this whole story. which actually I believe she said PBS had done a little bit of a documentary on. And the short of it is this: there was a group in the 1850s. There was a group of African Americans who decided to make a bid for freedom. This is before the Civil War, and they decided they would go west. And they went as far west, well, as they could. They went to San Francisco. And basically, and I'm really, kind of paraphrasing what probably happened, they looked around and said, doesn't work here. So they started going north. And they're still in the United States, like, doesn't work here. So they wrote to the then Governor General of British Columbia. And he basically said, look, if you folks can get here, I can help you settle. And the where he said he could help them settle turned out to be the Canadian Gulf Islands. And so I was blown away to realize that other than the Native American population that was first there, it was Africans who had been enslaved who actually settled the lands that we now know as the Canadian Gulf Islands. And Sylvia Stark in particular, she was just a character. I mean, she was like 4'11" with a shotgun, and you did not mess with her. And so it's this wonderful image that has been explored a little further historically. For anybody interested, you can go online, and search under Sylvia Stark to find out. But I think what's important there also is just to know that the area we live in is an area which also has a very deep and long history related to the Black experience here in the United States.
Muted. I think that that's a misconception that we're not connected in some way, to the Black history of the U.S. and that's obviously incorrect, as you're telling us.
Seattle itself often goes back to the founding in 1858 by a Black man named George Bush. Now, we're not talking about the former president, obviously,
Yeah.
but I think that's important. It's important just to understand, as I try to say in the book, that there isn't really an aspect of American history and life that is not connected in some way to the experience of African Americans being in this country. And of course, George Bush's experience founding this area, again, when I say founding, I want to be clear that what I'm talking about is that there were obviously people living here before, and that's the native tribes who were here, but he was one of the first non-natives to be in this part of the world. I think that's incredible. I think it's an important story to tell and to know and to own and to understand in history that so many of us don't get taught.
Absolutely. And I'll do a little shout out for our friends over at Black Heritage Society of Washington State. They are a wonderful resource, and they have been doing a lot to help educate folks about the history of Black people in Washington State and then in Seattle as well, specifically. Yes. So, so folks are seeming a little shy with their questions. I think maybe they're feeling a little shy, but so you and I can just chat a little bit. But do you want to talk a little bit more about the op-ed that you wrote, or are you want to drive people to read that and sort of so they can get all the salient points?
Well, no, I think this op-ed goes hand in hand with the op-ed I wrote not even 2 weeks ago, about a week ago in the LA Times. The LA Times op-ed was an op-ed which basically, I think it was captioned, "I never imagined that being a Black author would put me at risk." In that op-ed in the LA Times, what I really tried to accomplish was to help people understand that even writing about this stuff in this day and age is a risky venture for African American authors. Ibram Kendi, who wrote the book How to Be Anti-Racist, now has to travel with a security detail. Nicole Hannah-Jones, who was the author and lead researcher for the 1619 Project published by the New York Times, got death threats and racist threats based on her work. The funny thing is, Stesha, I'm not even sure it's funny. The sad thing is, in an hour and a half of that op-ed hitting in the LA Times, I got threats on social media, by email as well.
Oh my God, Clyde, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I think the way I can, and it's one of the reasons that Mark at the Seattle Times turned off comments for this particular op-ed. So, sometimes they have comments on, sometimes they
Yeah.
don't.
Yeah.
And, I thank Mark because in part, it's dangerous to tell the truth in this day and age. Whether you're
Yeah.
telling about the history of Black Americans, about women in this country, the truth about our LGBTQ brothers and sisters, our Native American brothers and sisters, it's not safe. It's not
Yeah.
safe. You've got governors of states who are willing to criminalize the very act of telling the truth. And
Yeah.
I find that both sad, but I also find for me, and I know for other authors, it's a call to arms to make sure we don't stop telling the truth. Again, it was about 2 weeks ago that President Biden signed the Ida B. Wells anti-lynching law. And I saw that again as this cluster of things happening at the same time. Ida B. Wells, of course, went to whoever was president in 1904, may have been McKinley, and said, we need a law against lynching. It took everything from, it's 1898 actually, it took 124 years for us to actually get that law. I think it was written 200 times before it was passed. But the thing for me that was important about Ida B. Wells is that she was an anti-lynching crusader who was run out of Mississippi with death threats because she told the truth.
Yeah.
And when I think about that, I can't help but going back to just this past March 12th, when former President Trump said to a group of his supporters in South Carolina, you need to lay down your lives to make sure that critical race theory is not taught in schools. That is an invitation to the kind of violence that is possible when people who, first of all, don't even understand what they're talking about, simply get amped up because somebody they respect says what they need to do. And we already seen where that can lead with the January 6th insurrection. Yeah. So the op-ed in the Seattle Times is kind of another piece of that block or that building that I wanted to present about what I thought are important truths that no one really wants to talk about in these days. I won't say no one, but a lot of people would rather be suppressed, that I think we need to talk about because it is the only way forward.
Absolutely. Well, I have maybe a slightly happier question to close out tonight. So I've been reading your blog and saw that you were writing about Washington State recognizing Juneteenth, kind of officially, and not kind of, actually officially, and it's coming up, in 2 months or so. Do you want to talk a little bit about your thoughts on that? And
wow, well, thank you for mentioning that. And I wish I could say it was happy, because I have to say for myself, I do not celebrate Juneteenth, and I never will celebrate Juneteenth for this reason. As far as I'm concerned, Juneteenth is a celebration of supposed African-American stupidity. And I say that in all honesty. Here's what the popular narrative on Juneteenth is. Well, Juneteenth is when General Granger made it to Galveston Island in Texas to tell those really dumb Black folks that, by God, you're free. It didn't happen that way. That is not what General Granger did on Galveston Island. In fact, all of the African Americans that were supposedly didn't know they were free, they knew all along they were free. They knew all along who had won the Civil War. Granger was in Galveston because the white plantation owners would not let go of their enslavement of those folks. That's the message he was there to deliver. And that is not how this national holiday is recognized. It's not what's said, and that's a truth that's not told. And that's why I really am very against the way we're celebrating this holiday, because it is a celebration of stupidity, as opposed to what was really going on was with the North trying to assert itself in terms of having won a victory in the war. That's the truth of Juneteenth. And that's what I think is important for people to know. And I could go on. I mean, I kind of said it earlier. The other reason I really, also am a little bit of a lot opposed to Juneteenth celebration is that in some ways it recognizes or celebrates Lincoln and the Declaration of Independence. I've already said Lincoln didn't free a single person with that declaration. There was a newspaper in England, the London Observer, who came out with an op-ed and said, "Boy, this American president is pretty weird because he's saying that he freed these folks, but he really didn't." All the major abolitionists of the day, I talk about this in the book, Frederick Douglass, Wilberforce, and others, they didn't even celebrate Juneteenth. They celebrated August 1st as Emancipation Day, and they did that because August 1st, 1834 was the date when the British law outlawing slavery in any part of the British Empire went into effect. That to them was real. What had took place in this country wasn't. And I think there's some reckoning that needs to take place there. My way of reckoning with it is I'm not going to celebrate a false holiday. I don't think it does service to the truth. So
Yeah.
you may not be happy, but thank you for bringing that up. I think it's an important notion that many people, Black and white, don't know that Juneteenth is not what it was cranked up to be. I'll say this as a conclusion. When I looked at who voted for that holiday, that in and of itself should have been a clue that there was something going on, something wrong. When Greg Abbott, Texas governor, would sign a bill and support that, when all of the conservative Republicans in the Senate would vote for it, somebody needed to look a little bit closer at why that was happening. And the reason it was happening is because that is not the truth about that day.
Yeah, interesting. Oh, we've got one. Oh, this is a big question, but I think it's a good one. So maybe if you have time, we'll stay for a second here. Dee asks, do you have any insights on how we could begin a truth and reconciliation in the Puget Sound area?
Absolutely. And I talk about that recommendation, I think, in the first paragraph of the op-ed in the Seattle Times. I think what Governor Inslee should do is to appoint a commission on reparations. And as part of that commission on reparations, it should also be charged with laying out a truth and reconciliation process. That I think would be a great way to do it. Let's do what California did. California, Governor Newsom impaneled a task force on reparations, and part of that had a public component of how do you engage the public around this process, and a truth and reconciliation process is how you engage the public around this issue. So yeah, I would love to see the governor take a lead in doing this. Washington State has a history of being out in front on reparations in terms of our Japanese American brothers and sisters. Let's do the same thing with African American history, and I would be great. And I think in paneling that commission, obviously you're going to appoint some people to that commission who might deliberate some of the questions that are important, and as part of the public outreach, set up the kind of truth and reconciliation commissions that we've seen in other places like South Africa and California. So I don't know if anybody from the governor's office is listening, or maybe they'll read the op-ed, but that's where I would start. Thank you. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. And then one last question. What's the best way for folks to be in touch with you after they've read your book? Is it your website or on Twitter, or is there a particular way that...
Go ahead. Well, first of all, thank you, Stesh. And I would say it's the book's website. There's a contact the author section, www.bloodandsweat.com. And also on that website is a lot of extra goodies. A lot of the actual source material that I used to write the book, you can find there, like images of Jefferson's writing and other things. Another really neat thing, I've got a geo-enriched section of the website where you can fly into with a 3D image of the Earth, any of the places that I talk about in the book. So you really get a feeling for what it's like to be there. So there's a lot on the website. You can contact me through the website as well, too.
That's great. That sounds super cool. We've been posting the link in the chat as well. So if you've been listening but you haven't been looking at the chat, if you scroll up through the chat, you'll see that we've posted Clyde's website there. We've also posted links to Clyde's books at elliottbaybook.com and the direct link there. And then also, of course, to his books at the library, of course, too, because you can get them there. I want to
Yeah.
thank you so much, Clyde. This was such an important and informational talk, and I can't wait to read the book, and I hope everybody else reads the book. And I loved how you closed that by saying you can't have truth and reconciliation without the truth part first. I think that that's so important. So thank you so much for that. As I mentioned, Elliott Bay Books have copies of Clyde's book available through their website. And of course, you can find his books at the library. And I'm going to post that link to the survey in the chat. I'll actually do it right now, so folks can let us know about what they think about tonight's program. And there's also an opportunity to tell us if there are other things you'd like to see the library or Elliott Bay host. And I'm grateful to everybody who made tonight's program possible. Thank you so much to our program partners and friends over at Elliott Bay Book Company, and to our sponsors, the Gary and Connie Kunis Foundation, the Seattle Times, and the Seattle Public Library Foundation. And of course, thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, Stasha, Karen, thank you so much. Look forward to seeing you soon.
In person next time, hopefully.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, good night.